Thanks to our panelists for emphasizing just culture is not a concept, it's a leadership behavior that must be lived daily. So we're coming up to our next agenda from day one of the seminar. Our next presentation comes from the National Transport Safety Center and focuses on the ideas learning from accident investigations. Please join me to welcome Mr. Naveen, who is the General Manager of Accident Investigation, the National Transportation Safety Center.
Look, my name's Naveen Kuzubakalam, and I want to start off with an apology, right? Because I'm going to take 10 more minutes than the time allotted to me, and that's only because I want to make sure you're all well and truly asleep by the end of this presentation. All right, let's start with that. Look, my name's Naveen Kuzubakalam, and I don't blame any of you if you can't pronounce my surname. I'm still struggling with it, so no offense taken. So it's a tough surname. So look, I work for the National Transport Safety Center. I'm an engineer by profession, so just a little bit about me. And prior to joining the NTSC here in Riyadh, I was the chief investigator of accidents for New Zealand. And in that capacity, I have headed 3 departments: the Department of Air Investigations, the Department of Rail Investigations, and the Department of Marine Investigations. I've been investigating accidents now for 15 plus years. So what that means is I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to learn from them, right? So anyway, look, that's a little bit about me, but today I want to focus our attention on three transformative themes that are reshaping how we approach accident investigations. I want to first start with systems thinking, right? And then I want to follow that up with how systems, there we go. I want to follow that up with how systems thinking finds its greatest expression within a just culture environment. And we had a fantastic speech by this panel about what just culture is, and hopefully I can add something to that. And finally, I want to address, the critical journey we are making at the National Transport Safety Center, transitioning from what we call a reactive agency to one that's intelligence-led, data-driven. Because that is the future, and that is how we will lead and deliver impact for transport safety in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. When I was putting these slides together today, I was trying to pinpoint a philosophy behind accident investigation. So I borrowed this phrase from our lovely colleagues at the National Transport Safety Board in the United States. And this is etched at the entrance to their training center in Ashburn, Virginia. And it says, from tragedy we draw knowledge to improve the safety of us all. And that really resonated with me because it leads really nicely into our mission at the National Transport Safety Center, which is to enhance transport safety by building community trust, to reduce serious harm through independent safety investigations, recommendations, and importantly, collaboration. And you would have noticed, those who are looking at the screen would have noticed that I've highlighted trust and collaboration in yellow. And that's because today's presentation is about trust and collaboration as much as it is about intelligence-led systemic investigations. And look, I'll keep coming back to this slide during the course of the presentation. It's an important slide. But first, a story. I'm going to tell a story. This is Antarctica. It is among the most remote and unforgiving places on planet Earth. On 28 November 1979, an Air New Zealand McDonnell Douglas DC-10 disappeared into Antarctica's icy wilderness. The aircraft struck a mountain, Mount Erebus, instantly killing 257 passengers and crew. No one survived. The accident is a textbook case of CFIT. And the aviators in the room know what CFIT is. For those who don't, it's controlled flight into terrain. And I'm going to talk about this accident very briefly. I won't be going into all the details. We don't have the time for that today. So it is simplified because I just really want to use this for providing context to what it is that I really want to talk about, which is systemic investigations. I just want to bring up these photos for a minute so we can all pause and reflect. On the top right hand is Air New Zealand flight Tango Echo 901 as she departs on a final voyage to Antarctica. And below that are the photos of the wreckage. Even after 45 years, the wreckage remains. And on the left are the 257 souls who perished on the day. And we remember. And we remember. But I don't want this to be just a story of tragedy and loss. Because it's also a story of learning. And it's also a story of our relentless pursuit of safer skies. So, as soon as the accident happened, what happens typically? You've got all of these people, several investigations. They're all trying to find out what happened, how did it happen, where did it happen, why did it happen, right? A few months later, this is what happened. The initial investigation found that the probable cause of the Erebus disaster was the captain's decision to descend below MSA, minimum safe altitude, under uncertain conditions. They attributed the tragedy to pilot error. Air New Zealand, the company, back then, Air New Zealand now is a very safe company, I promise you, but Air New Zealand back then said, yes, that's right. The crew are to blame. We are faultless. They flew the aircraft below MSA. They didn't follow procedures. It's all their fault. And guess what? These two bad apples, those people who are flying that aircraft, they learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow the rules. And we, and Air New Zealand, the company, we want to assure you, all of you flying public, that the bad apples are not here with us anymore, and we'll make sure we don't recruit those types of pilots. And because of that, the system is once again beautifully safe. It's fantastic again. Just get rid of the people who make mistakes. Then our systems will be a lot safer, right? Just get rid of them. Just get rid of them. That embodies a very interesting model of what makes systems risky and safe. And it's a sort of bad apple theory, right? You just get rid of the bad apples and your system will be fine again. And that's one way to look at it. But on the other hand, there are a number of inquiries that have taken a very different approach. And let's look at the inquiry. Let's look at one of them. An inquiry into the capsize of the passenger ferry Herald of Free Enterprise. I'm sure some of you in the room have heard of it. Disaster struck the English Channel on March the 6th, 1987, when the Herald of Free Enterprise capsized just moments after leaving the Belgian port of Zeebrugge. The immediate cause of the accident was a seemingly simple mistake. one of the crew on board forgot to close the bow doors, the front doors, tightly, and because of that, water was starting to seep into the cargo hold. And what happens is when you've got water inside an enclosed space, it starts to slosh, right? It goes from one side to the other. And that creates an effect called free surface effect. And free surface effect has a real detrimental impact on not just static stability, but also dynamic stability, right? And eventually the vessel will roll from left to right till it reaches a point called vanishing stability, and then the vessel will capsize. And that's what happened to the Herald of Free Enterprise. It capsized. So simple, right? You don't close the front door, what happens? You'll get water in, ship capsizes, end of story. We could write a report on it today, 10 minutes. But the inquiry into the accident revealed something much more deeper than that. It found a systemic problem within the ferry operator's culture, and I quote, "The investigation revealed a culture within the ferry company that prioritized speed and efficiency over safety protocols. This lack of focus on safety ultimately contributed to the tragic capsizing of the Herald of Free Enterprise." And look at that, 200 lives lost. These are all people with families and children and mothers and fathers, 200 lives lost, right? Look, I'll very quickly go through something more recent. This is the Grenfell Tower fire. I don't know if any of you remember this, but this was a horrific tragedy that occurred in London in 2017. A fire started in a refrigerator on a lower floor and then spread upwards due to the poor quality flammable cladding around the building. That cladding acted like a matchbox, and the fire just spread from one floor to the other, to the other, to the other. There was a rule on the building that said, if there's a fire, stay in your apartments, don't run. And even if you tried to run, the stairwell was so rickety and small, no one could escape. 72 people died. And most of those 72 are young kids, young children. It's a horrible, terrible tragedy. And you know what? The inquiry into this investigation, it revealed deep systemic issues, regulatory and scrutiny failure, cost cutting over safety, disregard for residential concerns. And you know what? Most of the people living in this building, most of the people were refugees, people who were coming from war-torn areas, who had nowhere to go to. And you know what? The owner of that building knew these people will never complain. It doesn't matter what you provide them or how you provide them, they will never put their head above the parapet and they will never complain, which ultimately resulted in a lot of them dying. Last one, take the Rogers Commission report into the catastrophic loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986. The immediate cause of this Challenger failure was right next to the booster. On the right side, there was an O-ring, and the O-ring is supposed to seal the fuel, the aviation fuel inside it. The O-ring leaked, the fuel came out, it contacted with a high energy point, and then it sparked, ignited, the shuttle's gone up in flames. So bad O-ring resulted in an explosion. However, the inquiry, the report highlighted a culture within NASA that prioritized meeting deadlines over addressing safety concerns. Meeting deadlines over addressing safety concerns from their scientists and their engineers and who else? So what we have here, so what I'm trying to describe here are two different interpretations of what we need to do to make the world better, safer. One is very reductionistic, right? Where we go in and we try and find out what's broken and then we try and fix it, right? Air New Zealand's management team were doing just that. They went in, they looked at the problem, and it's very clear to them that what's broken here is the crew, the terrible crew. And they need to be removed for the system to function safely. But on the other hand, we have these systems explanations, right? The system thinking. And an opportunity for all of us to tell a different story. So if you looked at the Erebus accident again and asked, did the crew on board have a responsibility to follow correct procedures. Yes, they did. Not denying that. Yes, they did. But was there this entire web of organizational decisions, ambiguous communication configured around that captain and that crew's decision? Absolutely, 100%. So if you truly want to understand why it made sense for the crew and on the flight deck to do what they did, then you've got to understand how these other systems interface with that decision-making process. That's really the key. And we'll look into it. We'll look into it very briefly. So, what caused an Air New Zealand aircraft to fly straight into a mountain, killing all of its passengers and crew instantly? Straight into a mountain. Well, here's what happened. During the early hours of November 28th, that's one night before the flight, an engineer, it's always an engineer decided to update one of the waypoints on the navigational system. So when the engineer updated the waypoint, they thought they were making a very minor adjustment of a couple of degrees. But it was actually deadly. They unknowingly shifted the path of the flight 27 miles to the east, directly over Mount Erebus. It gets better. It gets better. They changed the waypoint, but they forgot to tell the crew about the alteration. They thought, oh, it's just a couple of degrees, it's just a minor change, it doesn't matter, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. In New Zealand, we've got a saying, she'll be all right. That's probably the same approach. The crew had been briefed a couple of days ago, and they were told they're flying over McMurdo Sound, the valley, it's shown in the white dotted lines on the left. And they had no reason to believe otherwise. Well, you may ask me, but surely, Naveen, the crew should have noticed this big giant mountain, right? Surely. Yes, except the pilots were affected by a phenomenon called whiteout. That's where, for the non-aviators, that's where a cloudy white sky becomes indistinguishable from a snow-covered mountain. These guys couldn't distinguish between the mountain as it loomed right in front of them. You may also ask, well, surely, Naveen, they still shouldn't have flown below the permitted minimum safe altitude, right? Because if they were flying at the right height, they would have flown over Erebus, and this accident would never have happened. That's true. That is true. But what's also true is that the crew were under severe pressure from the organization to give the paying passengers an experience. There's no point flying at 30,000 feet, the company said. Give them a show, give them an experience, fly as low as you can, the company said. So although not formally approved, they were under pressure from management to descend to a very low altitude. And look, the reality is, if they were flying over McMurdo Sound, they might have been able to do that safely. The only problem is they weren't. They were descending on top of Mount Erebus. And the whiteout conditions that existed on the day sealed their fate. Ladies and gentlemen, these pilots, they didn't wake up in the morning to cause an accident. I promise you, they didn't wake up in the morning to cause an accident. They were simply making decisions grounded in the information available to them. This was not pilot failure. This was a failure of a system that was misaligned and opaque. So just maybe, the real story here is it's not pilot error, but a deep organizational failure, one rooted in poor communication, poor management, flawed procedures, managerial pressure. How do you protect our crew from such an unsafe work environment? Maybe this is a story about a lack of regulatory oversight, a lack of good governance. I mean, you can look at the Challenger tragedy. On one hand, you can look at the Challenger spaceship and say, oh, well, it's just an O-ring that's broken, so change the design of the O-ring, put a new O-ring in, chuck the spaceship up into space, and off you go. We're all happy, aren't we? Well, that's not what the report said. You know what the report said? The report pointed towards a cultural issue within NASA that prioritized deadlines over safety. And actually, you could go a little bit more deeper than that. You could also look at, the Cold War era in which NASA was operating. It was a period of intense competition between the United States and the then Soviet Union, right? So NASA was under constant pressure to meet deadlines as soon as possible. And that had an impact on safety. So look, what is my point? What am I trying to get out of all of this? Well, my point is, there are different stories you can tell. But if the story increasingly becomes a story of crime, then increasingly the result becomes punishment. And the consequences for that is pretty deep and severe. So, we at the National Transport Safety Center, we want to harness the power of thinking up and out, not down and in. And we'd encourage our safety partners here today to do the same if you're not already. Because I promise you that's going to pay richer dividend for our country in the long run. And that's what's going to keep our people safe. I'm getting there just past the halfway mark, so bear with me. So, systems thinking, really important at the NTSA. But I also think it's really important for us as an agency to be ahead of the curve, to transition from a reactive agency to one that is intelligence-led, data-driven. And for that, we need to look beyond accidents and serious incidents alone when we are trying to make systems and organizations safer. When an accident or a serious incident happens, what we do? We pay attention to the cause of the circumstances, right? And we ask these really important questions like, how did it happen? What caused it? Was it safety culture? Was it resilience? And all of those wonderful, lovely questions, because it's really nice if you can pinpoint what was missing. Because if you can pinpoint what's missing, then the solution is really simple, right? You go and you fix what's missing, put the new thing in, and then the problem is resolved, right? That's what we'd love to do. And that works, and you solve that accident. It works till the next accident comes along. And then what do we do then? We go running and try and fix the next problem. And then the next accident comes along, and we try and fix it. And Eric Hollnagel, PhD, explains this very well. There is a problem with this approach, and the problem is that we're only looking at snapshots of how the system worked when it failed. And if you look at this graph, this courtesy of Eric Hollnagel, it's a really interesting curve, right? So you've got all these green lines, and just below that, you've got this line called the line of unacceptable performance. Every accident that we investigate now is accidents that fall truly and well below the limit of unacceptable performance. But you know what? There's something really interesting happening about that line. The green lines over here, you can see they're quite fussy, and they're sort of going between positive performance, and then some of them really touch the limit of unacceptable performance, right? Those lines have a very important story to tell, and it's really important for us to pay close attention to what they're saying. Because if you look at the graph, it's going to tell you two things. It's going to tell you what's recurring and threatening to become an event of significance in the future. And importantly, it's also telling you how the system stopped it from becoming a significant event. So if you look at these lines, these are all, we almost had a near collision event. It's not, no event has happened, but if you can look at these lines and say, well, there's about 6 or 7 happening at this time of the year, at this point, that's information, that's intelligence, and you need to build on that. And it also importantly tells us, how did the system that you have, or the safety management system that you have, prevent this from becoming this? It's really important because how the system worked and how it got right most of the time is an important question that needs to be answered, because just as much as finding out how things go wrong, it's really important to know how things go well as well. Think about it. Because we get it right a lot more times than we get it wrong. I'll give you a quick analogy just to put some context around that. You know, you can spend all your time researching different illnesses, right? Their symptoms and their causes. And while that might give you a good understanding of what not to do, it wouldn't necessarily tell you how to achieve optimal health. And for that, you've got to learn from healthy habits. That approach would involve studying how healthy people live. You have to research good nutrition, exercise routines, stress management. And if you put all of that knowledge together, then you get a roadmap for achieving your goal of healthy life. So it's more than just investigating accidents and serious incidents. You've also got to understand what those high frequency, those green lines I showed you in the last slide, those high frequency, low level incidents are telling us. Look, if you look at this jar on the left, that's my first attempt at with AI to draw this. It looks reasonable, I think. So if you look at that jar, if the red stones indicate accidents and serious incidents, the green stones are all the times when there were no accidents. So things went well. So we need to understand what's happening there, because they provide opportunities to learn. And it's fair to say that there are more opportunities to learn when things go well than when things go terribly wrong. We're almost there. So look, studying and learning these low frequency, high frequency, low level impacts are really, really important. But I just want to sort of sneak up on that last discussion on just culture, because I do think there is one key ingredient to really help us harness those high frequency, low level incidents. Can anybody in the audience tell me what that key ingredient is? What do you really need to be able to truly be able to monitor, to anticipate and investigate successfully? The key ingredient is participation. People must be open to notify the regulator and safety agencies like the NTSC of incidents and accidents. They must be willing to share information in the aftermath of an incident, because that is the only way we can grow and learn. And I promise you, they will only do that. They will only do that if you create a just environment where they can share their stories without fear of retribution. And that really leads to my final topic very, very quickly, which is just culture. Now, there were some really good points from the last talk, and I think it's Adam who said information is the currency of safety, which I think is pretty brilliant. So far we've talked about reductionary heuristics and the need to think beyond that and to take a systems approach. And we've also told ourselves not to limit ourselves to serious incidents and accidents, but cast your net wider. Cast it wider so you can look at those low-level, high-frequency events, the green stones, so you can learn from them. But that still leaves the question about accountability and just culture. Because you know what? In reality, people want to hold others to account. We would love to sit here in this room and say, no, we believe in just culture and we'll do that. But human beings are human beings. We love to hold people to account. You know why? Because it's a Newtonian principle. Cause and effect is a Newtonian principle, which assumes there is symmetry between cause and effect. And for that to work, the cause has to be as large as the effect, or the effect has to be as large as the cause, right? Because if you have a very large effect, which is a lot of dead people, then we assume a large cause, a really big screw-up that really needs criminal prosecution. But we know that the circumstances that lead to an accident are much more complex and chaotic than that. Think the Erebus disaster, think the Space Shuttle Challenger, think the Grenfell Towers. We know that the circumstances of accidents are more complex and chaotic than that. But there's a problem, right? And the problem is that it puts our traditional, possibly current ideas about accountability under significant pressure. We find it difficult to look beyond that emotional satisfaction of having something or someone to blame. It's incredibly difficult. As passengers, as patients in a hospital, a part of us doesn't want to embrace this complexity that I'm talking about. We just want to know that that captain of that DC-10 New Zealand aircraft, which caused this terrible accident, has been punished. They killed my son, they killed my father, my mother, they need to be removed. And by removing them from the system, we love to believe falsely that the system is once again safe. People don't want to embrace complexity. You know why? Because we're all human. And you know what's the core thing about being a human? Human beings love simple explanations. Don't give me complexity, I just want simple explanations. So how do we deal with that then? How do we deal with accountability when we have to abandon these Newtonian notions? If I punch you hard, then you will punch me back just as hard. It's that Newtonian principle. How do we deal with accountability when we need to abandon them? Well, the starting point is, especially in safety critical sectors like ours, the starting point is that we really want them to tell us if there is a safety issue. Think about a nuclear power plant. Someone's operating a nuclear power plant. If something is wrong, if you're the manager, I would really like to know what's wrong before the whole thing explodes. And this goes for aviation, for the hospital sector, for air traffic control. All of these industries are acutely or should be acutely interested in the safety stories and incidents that happen out there. But the thing is, for people to come forward and share those stories, they have to feel reasonably secure. Feel safe that when they report, they will be treated fairly. That there will be no negative or disproportionate consequences if they report. And I'm talking on behalf of every captain and first officer who's flown on an aircraft, all the mechanics who sit at the bottom and try and keep these aircraft safe. They must feel secure. But there's a dilemma to that, right? You and I, as managers, we want to hear everything. We really want to hear what's going on. But we cannot accept everything that's going on. There'll be cases where you go, I have to hold somebody accountable for this action or this outcome. And look, I can understand that frustration. I have lived that frustration. But this is where the idea of just culture comes in. To try to balance accountability. Let me just move that slide so you can put something else here. There you go. To try to balance accountability and learning, to try to make us think differently about what accountability means so that we can make it compatible with learning, so that accountability and learning can actually go together. Just look at this. I'm not the best at making PowerPoints, but I hope I can sort of convey a message through this. What you don't want to do is name and shame someone just because he's reported an issue. What you also don't want to do is you don't want to let them scot-free. That's not no blame. We're not doing that either. Because if you do that, it discourages accountability. Neither do we want to name and shame them. What we want to achieve is something in the middle. That's just culture. Ultimately, what we want to find out, at the National Transport Safety Center it's not who made errors and who violated the rules, because Honestly, all of that's just backward looking. You're looking at the rear view mirror and you're looking backwards. It's really, dealing with things that have already happened. What we want to know is how we can improve the system in the future so that safety becomes more likely. That's my last slide. And if there's anything I'd like you to take away from this presentation, it's really these three things. Think systems. Look up and out, not down and in. Look up. Learn from the greenstones. There are more greenstones than red. Learn from them. Those incidents tell us stories. And then create an environment where people can safely say, I made a mistake, let me report it. Thank you, and kia ora.
Thank you, Naveen, for the very informative presentation. If you allow me, we'll take 10 to 15 minutes break, please, so we can conclude our session with the final panel. Thank you very much.